On behalf of City Lights booksellers and publishers and the City Lights Foundation, I'd like to welcome you to City Lights Live, our virtual reading series that follows in the footsteps of our in-store calendar during the time of the pandemic. As always, we are beaming to you for the unceded ancestral grounds of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area, from where we continue to celebrate the works of authors we know and love with readings, discussions, and forums, moving into the spring of 2022 and hopefully towards a COVID-free era. Tonight, we are delighted to have back in the house Joseph Matthews, celebrating the publication of his new novel. It's titled The Blast. It is published by our friends over at PM Press, purveyors of works that challenge political norms and encourage intelligent discussion on such issues as class consciousness, gender studies, do-it-yourself culture, and much, much more. A few words about Joseph before we begin. Joseph Matthews is the author of the novel Shades of Resistance, which is actually set in the period of the military junta in Greece, which is influenced by his time spent in Greece in the 70s and 80s. He's also the author of the short story collection, The Lawyer Who Blew Up His Desk, and also a book of political analysis titled Afflicted Powers, Capital and Spectacle in a New Age of War, which was co-written by Ian Bull and T.J. Clark, as well as Michael Watts. Joseph was formerly a criminal defense lawyer working in San Francisco, specializing in criminal and political cases of anti-Vietnam War activists and Mission District Barrio residents. He's also well known for defending prisoners during the California prison rebellions of the 70s. He served as a public defender and is also taught at the Law School of the University of California at Berkeley. So please join us now in giving a warm welcome to Joseph Matthews. Welcome to City Lights Live.
Peter, good to see you, as always.
Likewise, it's been ages, and this is really a delight. Yeah. Amazing what this pandemic has done to us.
Yeah.
Gosh, you know, this is such an incredible book on so many different levels. First, I'd like to congratulate you, really, on just creating such a multi-layered and very immersive novel, and one in which San Francisco is really just as much one of the characters as are the protagonist. I mean, you've infused this book with so much political history, labor and class-related history. You've kind of plumbed the depths of San Francisco's immigrant landscape, and especially the interrelation between the Irish and the Italian cultures. You've also cast a spotlight on the plutocracy that ravaged the city, and also, you know, the radical workers and the revolutionaries that fought back. So to me, at its core, I really feel like this book is one about dialogues between people, but also dialogues between political systems, between the past and newly emerging futures. Radical politics play an important role in the city's history, as you've shown very, very clearly. And this is kind of part of San Francisco history that's been conveniently obscured in more recent times. So I was hoping maybe you could begin by reading an excerpt from the book, just to give everyone kind of a taste of your prose. But then also, if you could offer us a little bit of background about the book, maybe create some context about the book's protagonist. We have Kate Jameson, we have Baldo Kavanaugh. Just create a little bit of backdrop for us, if you would.
Right. Well, I'll get to that, Peter. First, though, I want to say thanks to you, not just for tonight, but I think you know, everybody should recognize that Peter has been doing this for 30 years. Peter. Something like that, right? Yeah, but you know, he has been valiant in keeping things going, presenting not just a series of author readings, but also events around literary themes. He's been a valiant character. We all know about City Lights books, but Peter himself has been, you know, a trooper. And you know, does it with a lot of elan, and I just wanted to say thanks and congratulations to you, Peter. And I also want to give a shout out to the folks at PM Press who published this novel and my last novel, Everyone Has Their Reasons. Just a tremendous crew of people, just with a lot of intelligence and a lot of care that they give. Stephen, Stephanie, Michael, Gregory, Brian, the great designer, John Yates, the cover man who created this wild and amazing, wonderful cover. And most of all, Ramsey Kanaan, the publisher, the founder, publisher, and great editor at at PM who is indefatigable and brave, and just, an amazing institution unto himself. So The Blast. Yeah, it's set in San Francisco, much of it in North Beach, the neighborhood where I'm sitting right now and where City Lights is, 100 years ago, 1916. And 1916, as Peter adverted to, was a tumultuous time and place in San Francisco. The city was booming for a lot of reasons. The city had made a lot of money in the 1880s and 1890s with the advent of oil and mining, shipping. The Philippines War, the occupation there was all filtered through San Francisco, and tremendous amounts of money was made by the oligarchs of San Francisco. Then after the quake, the rebuilding was fueled by a tremendous lumber business and mining, and then the Panama Canal opened, so that San Francisco was the hub of Pacific trade. So there was tremendous amount of money and capital energy in San Francisco. At the same time, labor was extremely strong, in part because there was so much labor needed. And much of that labor was immigrant labor, because San Francisco was an immigrant city, a relatively new city. At the moment of 1916 that we're talking about, there was almost, you could call it a class war going on in San Francisco between extremely powerful industry barons and very powerful labor unions, as well as those who were laborers, political laborers, who were outside the traditional unions. The traditional unions still were very exclusionary with regard to race and ethnicity. The large Chinese population was excluded. The post-Civil War Black population was excluded. And much of the immigrant population from what was known as the Latin world, which included the many thousands of Italian immigrants, were excluded from much of labor. So you had capital and labor at war, but you also had a further left group of radicals, of radical workers, many of whom were Italian and based in North Beach. And those were the folks who, around whom this novel is crafted. I don't know how many of you have seen the cover, but there's a great photograph on the cover of this group of characters standing, showing off their weapons at a shooting range just south of San Francisco. And this was the anarchist Will group based in North Beach. And they play a significant role in the story. At the same time in San Francisco, and I'll try not to go on too long, in the whole country, the question was the US going to enter the First World War in Europe? And the pros and cons of that broke down along a lot of the same lines as the industrial battles did. That is, the industrialists wanted to join the war, the banks wanted to join the war, and the working class basically knew that they were the ones who were going to get killed and had no hunger for it. So there was a movement called the preparedness movement, which was a euphemism for pushing the US into the war. That was going on at the same time as the labor battles. And the preparedness movement culminated in 1916 with a huge, what was called preparedness parade down Market Street, which ended with a terrible bombing that killed a number of people and wounded many more, and which set back the cause. It was blamed on two labor people characters, Tom Mooney and Warren Billings, who feature in the book. They were framed, sent to prison, and weren't released for 20 years when it was shown that the whole thing was a frame-up. So all of these turmoils are going on simultaneously in San Francisco, and much of it focused in North Beach, in our neighborhood, Peter, in City Lights' neighborhood. So I'm going to read a little section. The book has two main characters. One is a guy named Baldo Kavanaugh. His nickname is Blue. He's half Irish and half Sicilian. Born and raised in San Francisco. He's left San Francisco for 3 years, escaping, following his mother's death and a terrible split with his longtime best friend. And he's now just returned. And Baldo is, because of his Sicilian background and growing up in North Beach, is close with these characters in the Volontà group. And I'm going to read a little section to start with, where Blue makes his first visit back to the Volontà meeting rooms, which are on the corner of Washington Square. Those of you who know San Francisco, North Beach, it's on the corner of Washington Square, was the Volontà group's meeting rooms. I have to take off my glasses to read, so I won't be able to see you very well, but that's how I can read the book. So Blue is going his first visit back to the Volontà rooms. Even before he got through the door, Blue could hear the delicious sounds of a full-bodied disputà in Italian. Parmesan on pasta al vongole, that's pasta with clams. On pasta al vongole, minga, what are you, fucking French? The meeting rooms of the Gruppo Anarchico Volontà, the anarchist wheel group, were on the corner of Union and Stockton Streets, facing Washington Square, the North Beach neighborhood's central piazza. When Blue entered the large ground floor room, about a dozen men and a couple of women, most in their 20s and 40s, were rustling about, some of them looking through newspapers and pamphlets and broadsheets held by clothespins to a wire strung the length of one wall, others moving in and out of a rear room where Blue could see there was another hive of activity. The loud argument, though, was coming from one side of the front room, where 8 or so men were hovering over a laden table. It was difficult to tell how many were actually involved in the work at hand and how many were just volunteering opinions. Across its breadth were laid out various ingredients for the hot meal that the group prepared each Saturday evening, in addition to the clothes and food they regularly donated to the free clinic just up the street, and served to neighborhood denizens who otherwise might not see as good or filling a plate the rest of the week. On this occasion, provisions cadged from local fishermen and foodstuff purveyors included a huge mound of clams in shells dumped onto layers of newspaper, an impressive pile of garlic, several bouquets of flat leaf parsley, a 2-foot-high stack covered with grease paper, out of which peeked the curled ends of freshly weaned, and a couple of clear bottles of full, deep green olive oil. A score of long, crusty loaves of bread were piled atop and alongside a well-worn wine barrel next to one end of the table, while on the floor at the other end were 2 large iron cauldrons settled on gas-fired cooking rings. The man who was loudly objecting to putting Parmesan on clam pasta held a block of the offending cheese in one hand, waving it over his head. French, another man shot back in Italian. Ah, you mule sniffer, what the hell does a farmer know about clams? Recognizing the 2 antagonists, Blue understood the farmer slur. Genio, recipient of the taunt, was in fact anything but a farmer. He was originally from Palermo and had spent an entirely urban childhood and young manhood there before moving across the ocean and then continent to live another entirely urban life in the center of San Francisco. But Genio's family name was Forcone, which means pitchfork, and thus offered a convenient trajectory for barbed remarks during the frequent disputes that erupted among the habitués of the Volontà rooms. No, no, you're right, Genio replied, suddenly calm. Not French, no. It's what, and his voice pitched up again with each following word, it's what a stinking barbarian would do. You ignorant Terroni, the first man sputtered in a northern Italian pejorative used against Southerners, meaning peasant, which in this case also conveniently fit the theme of the previous farmer jibe. That's right, barbarian. Genio now noticed Blue and spoke directly to him, switching from Italian to Sicilian. Hey, Baldino, am I right? Only a barbarian would put cheese on clams, or an Englishman. Blue struggled to hold an expression that the two men would read as commensurate with what he knew was the seriousness of their emotions, despite the triviality of the subject matter. The men's vituperations were couched in campanile, the strong sense of identity with a local home region of Italy, rather than with any broader sense of Italianness. It was only outsiders, particularly the Northern Europe-rooted San Francisco business elite and the mainstream unions, who lumped all these men together as Italians, usually in order to denigrate and ostracize them. A categorization that, ironically, brought these otherwise fiercely anti-nationalist men together from time to time for collective self-preservation. But Blue had grown up around these men, was happiest or nearest to happy in their company, and understood that behind the campanilismo there simmered other politically meaningful divisions about which the question of cheese on clams provided just one more in an endless stream of reasons or excuses for venting it. So it gives you a little flavor of the kind of fractious groups that were politically deeply engaged, but were also riven by all kinds of divisions among themselves, even within families, personal divisions, political divisions, violent people who believed deeply in propaganda by the deed, violent acts against individuals, people who believed in different levels of political violence, people who believed in cooperating with unions, people who wanted to work completely outside of unions. These people were able to come together from time to time in actions against the state, the police, and often against the church, who at this time was an enormously powerful institution still in running people's lives. So, that gives you a little flavor of this group. And let me just read one more little bit of this. Then there was Blue himself. As for campanilismo, he was able to skirt its labeling strictures because he was misto, a mongrel. He was born in the US rather than in the shadow of any homeland campanile, and he was the issue of a Sicilian-Irish coupling that shunted him outside the bounds of all recognizable identities. Politically, Blue never chose among the competing positions, not least because the militant milieu's ideological sands themselves and their adherents were constantly shifting. There was a bountiful, if shuddering, flow of local, national, and international radical newspapers and journals, preventing various shades of syndicalist, anarchist, illegalist, and propaganda of the deed arguments. A few journals in English or Italian had substantial lifespans, some of them produced in San Francisco itself, including a monthly publication by Alexander Berkman, infamous for his attempt to assassinate Henry Clay Frick of Carnegie Steel, who had recently relocated to San Francisco and was publishing the paper out of his flat in the Mission District, and who had given the paper the provocative or foolhardy, probably both, name The Blast. But there were also many other journals and pamphlet series that appeared, then quickly disappeared in sectarian chaos seemingly every month. The joke went, lock 2 anarchists in a room, come back in an hour, and you'll find either 2 dead bodies or a new newspaper. So the chaos among very passionate people who were excluded from much of organized labor, excluded from many kinds of jobs, but who managed to find ways to join each other despite all the differences, to take actions in support of free speech. Birth control was one of their big issues, rights of women, an amazing bunch to volunteer.
I mean, it's amazing to me just how many of these issues follow us to this day. And I remember Lawrence Ferlinghetti once told me when he arrived in North Beach at the end of World War II, the first thing that really impressed itself upon him was the awareness of all the Mussolini supporters that were in the neighborhood. But then again, the fully fledged Italian anarchists, I mean, you had them kind of these two strains side by side.
Sometimes within the same family.
Yes, exactly. It was crazy. And they would oftentimes get into fights in front of the store. Like some of the garbage men were like part of this like anarchist contingent, and they'd have their newspapers and they would like clash with these like Mussolini supporters. And just like as in your novel, I mean, you have these like histories that sort of intersect and intertwine, and it really, and you also, you have a history that can't be separated from the US imperialist conquests. I mean, this is what's also really fascinating. Could you talk a little bit about what it was like kind of weaving the political narrative of the book, and also kind of in relationship to North Beach? I mean, and also, were you surprised by anything that you found?
Yeah, I mean, as you can tell, or those of you who have read the book, or hopefully will read the book, will know there's an immense broad spectrum of research that went into this. And of course, as a longtime resident of North Beach, getting deeper and deeper into the history of the city and the neighborhood was a lot of fun for me. So yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think I tried to get into the book was the way in which international political events redounded in San Francisco. So for example, there is a thread about the US occupation of the Philippines following the Spanish-American War that follows through the novel, partly dealing with, one of the characters who's one of the two main characters, Kate Jameson, her husband, joined a surgeon, joined the army at the beginning of the Spanish-American War because he wanted to help free Cuba, where he had a great attachment. Instead, he was sent to the Philippines, was part of the US occupying forces, saw and participated in horrific things there, was never the same, came back and wound up committing suicide. And Kate Jameson, one of the two main characters, is constantly filtering through her head during the course of the book the ways in which she might try to understand what happened to him in the Philippines versus but as part of the reason for his suicide later in the US. But the Philippines occupation was also a big part of why San Francisco was a boom town around, in the late 1890s and early 1900s. All of the military expenditures for the Philippines, for the occupation of the Philippines, was filtered through San Francisco. And the taking of the Philippines also opened the Pacific to US domination of Pacific trade, all of which was centered in San Francisco. So the incredible amounts of money flowing through the city because of larger political events, in this case, the occupation of the Philippines, resounds through the course of the novel. Novels are driven by characters, at least narrative novels are, my novels are. And these two characters carry the narrative. However, the nature of San Francisco, its history and the crises of its present moment in 1916 are not just the historical context, but they're the warp and woof that these characters have to work their way through.
I want to remind everybody, we have posted links in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard with which you may purchase copies of the book. Also, I've noticed some questions are already coming in, and we will get to those a little bit later. But Joseph, could I have you read a little bit more and give us some more, a little bit more of a taste of the book?
Well, let me read you a little bit about Kate Jameson. She's one of the two main characters. She was a working class girl from South Boston, Irish, named Katie Carey, who was bright enough to go to teacher training school, where she met a young doctor from an upper class Irish family. They got married, much to the chagrin of his family, who thought that she was way too A-class A for him. Had a child named Maggie, and he helped her to start going from teacher training school to law school, night law school, which was very rare then for women. But then he joined the army for the war, was sent to the Philippines, and when he came home, he was a shattered version of himself, then committed suicide, and she became a widow at a very young age with a young daughter, and was dropped by the Jameson family back into her working class status. And she had to work at menial jobs because she couldn't finish law school, etc. She is taken up by Robert Lansing, Secretary of State at the time, the actual Secretary of State, who created a forerunner of the CIA. It was called the U-1 Bureau, a secret investigative bureau. And he was trying to determine what support would be from West Coast industrialists if the US entered the First World War, because the West Coast was like Mars to the East Coast, and yet they knew it was extremely important for shipbuilding, for oil, for armaments. So he sends Kate Jameson, who had spent time in San Francisco while her husband was recovering from the Philippines war there, and who had the Jameson name, and who was clearly very bright, to go to San Francisco and try to insinuate herself into the upper echelons of the business community and get a feeling and report back to him about what the tenor of support would be for the war. So here's Kate Jameson, Kate Carey, as she is on the train about to reach San Francisco for the first time. Those hands, emerging from a reverie about early days with Jamey, that's the husband. Kate realized that her hand was running back and forth through the deep maroon velvet of the seat. And once again, she marveled at finding herself in this private compartment of a first-class car, just 5 days out of Boston, yet remarkably on the new Transcontinental Express, only one more until she would reach San Francisco. Marveled, but was also discomfited by the car's fulsome gilt and purple splendor, by the steam-heated air as soft as the carpet, by the porters in their crisp white jackets, bringing her fresh towels each morning, and asking whether Madam would be taking breakfast in the dining car, and asking whether Madam, was there anything Madam needed? Asking her, Kate Jameson, though despite all the years married and widowed with that surname, to herself, abetted by unrelenting, subtle, and not so subtle reminders from the Jameson family, notwithstanding their ironic decision to call her Catherine. She was still and always would be in her own mind, just Katie Carey from South Boston, a Southie. How did she get here? And tomorrow, San Francisco, again, after so long. Images from that city, from her months there with Jamey and daughter Maggie, now flitted behind her eyes as if on a cinema celluloid that keeps skipping off its sprockets, each street or building or room making a tantalizing appearance, then sputtering away before she can quite manage to bring it into focus. Well, no surprise, she consoled herself. It had been 15 years now. And anyway, after the great quake and fire a decade ago, how much of the rebuilt city would she even recognize? She bent her head, shook it slightly, and again caught sight of her hand splayed there on the compartment's velvet seat cushion. Those hands, Jamey would say now and again, the words and his slightly awestruck expression coming always as a surprise to her. He'd be staring at them, her hands, captured by them. Then slowly he'd look up at her with sweet, crinkling eyes. Ah, Jamey, she said aloud, granting herself permission for thoughts that in all the years since he'd been gone, she had struggled against so mightily, especially while Maggie was still at home. because to think of him too often or too intensely would have been to risk speaking of him. And that was closely guarded again, except ever so briefly and in a deliberately vague, if always adulatory way, intended to shut down quickly the rare direct foray about him from Maggie. Part of the long-held evasion. The conspiracy of silence concocted in the very first days after Jamey's death between Kate and her family, the Careys, to shield the little girl Maggie, at the time only 6 years old. Insisted on too by the Jameson family to protect their name. But in truth also for Kate herself, to wall herself off from such pain and incomprehension that could not otherwise be managed, and such anger. Silence as a way to carry on. For Maggie, yes, and for herself. It was not the sight or feel of Kate's own hands, though, but sense memories of his, her husband's hands, those surgeon's hands that now rushed through her blood and flushed her cheeks. Since Maggie left home more than a year ago, Kate had begun allowing thoughts of Jamey to reemerge, slowly. But as she neared San Francisco, echoes and images from her time with him there had begun to tumble over one another, ungovernable, unstoppable, like falling downstairs. She'd feared this, or perhaps hoped for it, when she'd accepted this strange job, this expedition, as she'd think of it. But already she was finding that knowing this might happen and experiencing it were very different things. And the closer she got to San Francisco, the more agitated she became. Because also, what if she really did manage to find Maggie there in San Francisco? Which after all was part of why she'd agreed to go. That, and because for the first time she'd be escaping, at least for a while, the years-long suffocations of her life after Jamey in Boston. And yes, also for the seemingly exorbitant expense monies and the hefty pay, more than 5 times what she was then earning at her law firm clerking job, and even greater multiples more than what she and Maggie had lived on for most of the years after Jamey had died. For that matter, far more than when he'd been alive, with money so far down the list of things he'd cared about, which had only added to the Jameson family's chagrin over his marriage to this young Carey girl, this Southie, whom they blamed for expecting or demanding nothing more of him. But without an actual address for Maggie in San Francisco, or even a wisp of other information, just the note card that arrived over a month ago. Dearest mother, doing fine, San Francisco, don't know why. Much love, your Maggie. Kate knew that it was extremely long odds to find her, if she was even still there. Maggie, whose notes to Kate, all as brief as this latest, had arrived in Boston every month or so from different spots on the map, always moving, always west. Maggie, who seemed almost casual in this minimal contact with her mother, who could have no way of knowing the surge of joy and longing that Kate felt each time she saw even just such few words sloping across a card in her daughter's lovely flowing hand. Maggie, hands. How would Kate begin finally to speak to her about Jamey? When Maggie left Boston, fled the years-long silence and its penumbra there, Kate understood that she waited too long to speak to her about Jamey and vowed to hold back from her no more. But how to go about it after all this time? And in truth, what could Kate tell her? Because how much, how deeply did Kate herself understand? So that's Kate walking into this strange expedition, as she calls it, that she's been given a job, but also looking for the ghost of her husband, Jamey, who spent time with her in San Francisco after he came back from the Philippines, a changed man. perhaps looking for her daughter and perhaps finding her. And also just escaping from the years in Boston under which she lived such a suffocating life. So she's got a lot of stuff going on, but doesn't know where she's going. It's an interesting moment for her, and it plays out in interesting ways, I hope you'll find as the book goes on.
Well, besides your gorgeous prose, one of the other great pleasures for me has been just like the layering of history and personal history intertwined with political history. Just so beautifully done. I think this might be a really good moment to begin taking questions because they're starting to actually come through in the chat. Lisa asks, how did you research your Italian characters?
How did I research my Italian characters? Well, there's a tremendous amount of local information in North Beach about the Italian, Little Italy in general, and the anarchist milieu. There's a note at the end of the book about some of the sources that I used. There's a tremendous book called Immigrants Against the State by an academic named Kenyon Zimmer, which is about Italian and Yiddish, interestingly, in alternating chapters, anarchists in America. And his book by itself was an extraordinary fount of information. But I also got in touch with him about some of his sources. He put me in touch with some people who had some unpublished materials. I read an extraordinary unpublished memoir by someone who grew up in a house I can see out my window right here in the 1920s, the daughter of an anarchist family. And so, you know, one thing led to another. These unpublished materials came to me, and I was able to put together a picture of what that extended Italian world of the teens and 20s looked like. And, you know, the other truth is that continuing to live in Little Italy now, as Peter knows from being in City Lights for so many years, there's still there's a flavor, there's an Italian flavor. And many of the things, places, institutions, the focaccia's, you know, bakery, were here in 1916. And so it continued to inflect life in San Francisco now. And so living here, I think, you know, helped me to have a kind of sensibility about life 100 years ago here among the same Italian families.
So Ron asks, how would you compare and contrast the writing of this novel with your Greenspan novel?
Well, I don't know how many of you know. My last novel was a novel about a character named Herschel Greenspan, who was, it was set in 1938 in Paris. He was an immigrant who shot and killed a German consular official, and which was used as an excuse for Kristallnacht. That book was written, that's an epistolary novel, was written entirely through the form of letters, but wound up, so it was a first person novel, but through letters. This is a third person novel, so very different structurally, even though both were rooted in deep research, deep historical research. The structure of the writing was completely different. And so for me, it was just a new set of challenges, how to go about that. That also had basically one central character, where this has two. So, you know, I set myself a different sorts of literary challenges, even though both novels were set in historical periods that I wanted to bring to life as part of each novel.
I think this next question, you may have already partly answered it, but I'll ask it. Maybe you could answer another aspect of it, because we had been talking earlier about like your methodology in terms of, you know, how you do your research. But Pat asks, Looking forward to reading your book. What were your sources for the historical background? Where did you do your research?
Yeah, I sort of partly answered that. And at the back of the book, there are a number of sources in an author's note. There are a number of the sources listed. Research is it's a complicated business, and those of you who have done research know that you go in one direction and it knocks you into another direction, which knocks you into another direction. There is a lot of, so for example, the Philippines War, there's an awful lot of material, even though it's an absolutely unknown, piece of American history. There is, in fact, a lot of academic and journalistic work on it. So researching that was, a fairly straightforward thing. There's a chapter, you may not know how it gets there, but you'll find out when you read the book, about the English suffragettes who were active at this same moment. The Blue character spends a year in London with the suffragettes. There's a ton of material available about the suffragettes. Other things, though, about San Francisco itself was much tougher. There are a number of online sources which provide photographs, which are immensely useful because, of course, as a writer, you can extrapolate from the images that are offered by photographs. And then there were two books on the Mooney and Billings case. Mooney and Billings were the two labor activists who were charged with and convicted of the Preparedness Day bombing. There were two very fine books done about their case and about the frame up of their case. And so that also had a tremendous amount of material in it, which then led me to labor histories, et cetera. So one thing leads to another. That's how I immerse myself in one thing, and it winds up leading me elsewhere. Let me read one little bit of just for about the Italian, the sense of what Italian North Beach was like in 1916. Let me read you a little piece about Blue's background. Baldo Kavanaugh. His name is Baldo, a Sicilian first name. His last name Kavanaugh from his father. His nickname Blue, which he got from his involvement in boxing. Blue had left high school without finishing. In his early teens, boxing and the various side jobs given to him by Flaherty, the gym owner, had increasingly challenged Blue's attention to formal education. Still, he kept at it until the fall of 1900, when he was 16, when the news about Declan reached the little North Beach flat that Blue shared with his mother. Declan, dead in the Philippines War, his big brother, Declan. Excuse me, a sip of water. Blue's mother, Marikia, was shattered by her elder son's death. She had managed just to hold herself together over the several years since her husband had left, taking with him not only the income he brought in, but also her status in the neighborhood as a married woman. The paltry pay she got for her work at a cigar factory during those years was supplemented by money Declan and Blue brought in from their late night endeavors. Marikia asked for no details. And by the vegetables she was allotted for her work with fellow Sicilians at their communally tended truck farm on the southern outskirts of the city. There were also occasional neighborhood contributions of fish and milk and cheese to La Vedova, the widow, and her boys, and frequent donations from a local baker who would call to Baldo whenever he'd pass and hand him warm focaccia straight out of the wood-fired oven, even though this baker was Ligurian and church-going, whereas Marikia and her boys were neither. Of course, Marikia wasn't actually a widow, at least not as far as anyone knew, but she was considered as such by many of the materially supportive but socially judgmental neighbors. Well, what could you expect, it was said? of a mixed marriage like that. Marikia bore it all in silence. Declan bore it by drinking. Blue by beating the crap out of everyone he met in the boxing. Once Declan was gone, the teenage Blue was on his own, supporting himself and his mother. Fortunately, when he turned 16, he started getting paid above board for boxing matches, and the gym owner, Flaherty, obliged him with more side work too. But when he wasn't working, boxing, or training to box, Blue was at home as much as possible. By that time, Marikia's poor health had forced her to quit the cigar pack. As a Sicilian, she'd never been given one of the slightly better paid jobs as a cigar roller, which the Genovese owners and foremen gave to the Lucchese and other Ligurian women, but was consigned instead to the cutting room, where years of inhaling tobacco shards had left her lungs in ruin. And the only work she was able to manage now was a bit of mending she did at home. She no longer went to help out at the truck farm. She stopped visiting with neighbors. For the most part, she stopped leaving the little apartment at all. She hardly ate unless Blue fixed her something and sat with her. She didn't say much unless Blue coaxed her to speak of her childhood in Sydney. She didn't move much unless Blue went down with her down the 3 flights of stairs and out for a short walk. The only time she smiled was when Blue read to her. Work for Flaherty, training in boxing matches, occasional forays of minor criminality, and close care of his mother. Other things had to go. School was one of them. From early on, but not reading. From early on, reading. Anything he could get his hands on. The North Beach district of Blue's youth was flooded with local, national, and international broadsheets, newspapers, and pamphlets in both English and Italian, and numerous places where he could read free copies. The local branch of the public library for the more respectable papers, and politically sectarian storefront social groups for the more scandalous and subversive journals. In his adolescence, he also discovered the city's several radical bookshops, in a couple of which he was allowed to sit undisturbed to pore over the papers and journals. The neighborhood library also had a good collection of books in Italian. So during his teenage years following Declan's death and into his 20s, when Blue spent so much time at home with his mother, he was able to continue his education despite having dropped out of school, filling many hours reading variegated volumes of history and literature in both language, some to himself, some out loud in Italian to his mother. His education continued in other ways too. Lottie Backstrom, a newcomer to the city who lived just across the rear alleyway, had a merchant seaman husband who was away for months at a time and who apparently was no bargain when at home either. At age 16, Blue found that the initial enticement of Swedish meatballs wasn't the only thing on offer if he quietly made his way up Lottie's rickety back staircase late at night. The fact that he always had a book with him and would read at any quiet moment was one of the several things that had endeared Blue to the theater women whose paths he'd crossed in Dublin in 13 and 14, and to a particular one of a group of suffragette women in London with whom he'd engaged after Dublin. In fact, the parting gift he'd been given by the London woman with whom he'd been most intimate on his departure from England in early 15 was a book, the novel Howard's End. He'd read it as he'd made his way back across the Atlantic and the States to San Francisco, savoring it even more after he was able to laugh at himself for having wondered in the first several chapters when Howard would appear. Though he'd been unsympathetic at first to the dithering of the novel's rich people and irritated by the residual costliness of its pallid bohemians as they purported to separate themselves from the anxious middle classes, he soon settled down to appreciate the book's examination of human foibles across a spectrum of social positions. More than once, he'd marveled at the acuteness of the author's specific perception, one of which in particular had stayed with him. The most unsuccessful life, the author wrote, is not that of a man who is taken unprepared, but of him who has prepared and has never taken. Blue had copied it onto a scrap of paper next to a line another suffragette close companion in England had introduced him to. The tigers of wrath are wiser than the horses of instruction. Given his antipathy toward the church, which had been so much inflamed by his recent experiences in Dublin, Blue had particularly liked the fact that this latter sentiment came from a work called The Proverbs of Hell. Blue had been captivated by each of these lines, not because they introduced him to notions he'd never considered, but rather because they confirmed sensibilities he'd always deeply felt, but never seen expressed. If your juices tell you something, he later framed these sentiments himself, it's true. So Blue believed in the moment, in the verities of his gut, believed that caution was the same coin as surrender, and that its only purchase was emptiness. So that's a little peek at Blue and his growing up in North Beach and the difficulties that people faced in a very difficult, complex ethnic mix, and a mix of where the mother, because she's Sicilian and not Ligurian, gets the shitty job in the cigar factory. I mean, these things were going on. At the same time, people were trying to come together and fight against the larger forces. So it was quite a complicated admixture in North Beach at the moment. So maybe some questions.
Yeah, well, I love that you brought in focaccia and Swedish meatballs, because food also plays such an important role in politics as well as one's social sphere. So, okay, let's see. Muriel says, thanks for strong women characters and the fascinating history of San Francisco in this period. You seem to like writing about women, and as a woman, can you talk about the women in the book?
I will briefly, and then I'll read one final small section about Kate, the women in the book. I think you'll find that there are a lot of really interesting, strong women in the book. There is a woman physician who represents what was a sort of a network of women physicians up and down the West Coast at the time. Rare to have women physicians, and they mostly all knew each other. They took radical positions with regard to women's rights, with regard to birth control, and became radicalized and had a network. And there's a woman character in the book who's a sort of distillation of those women. Kate herself is an incredibly strong woman, given what she's been through and what she has to face when she's in San Francisco. Her daughter, Maggie, who is in San Francisco and does play a part in the book. Interestingly, it's Blue who finds her, not her mother. And he encounters her, and she, even though she's a very young woman, understands both what his complicated attractions are and what his deep failings are. One of the things about novels is that they allow you to range fairly widely in the kinds of things you can address within any given storyline. And I know we're getting towards an hour, and I won't keep going for too long. But one of the things that I was able to address in the book, not address, but explore in the book, was the relationship between parents and children from the perspective of the parents and adult children, parents looking at how they have raised children and what their relationships are from the perspective of the parent. And there's almost nothing in the history of literature that does this. It's quite remarkable. There are loads of memoirs about horrible parents and how they, screwed you up, and drunken fathers, and, all this kind of stuff. There's almost nothing about what I call the crucible of a parent's crucible in how to go about enacting your love for your child on an ongoing basis. So let me just read a little bit of Kate, who is hoping to find her daughter Maggie in San Francisco. And she hires a private investigator to see if she can find Maggie. And Kate is sitting in her hotel room, her very expensive hotel room at the Palace Hotel, still there on Market Street. And she's thinking about what she's going to tell the private detective about Maggie to try to help him find her. Kate wasn't sure what she'd say to Swanson about Maggie having gone to nursing school, because Maggie had left just before finishing without taking a certificate, turned her back on it. And on their plan, well, Kate's plan, Maggie had taken pains to point out it, for Maggie to follow it on to medical school, to become a doctor like her father. Though Kate had never invoked Jamey's name in that regard, rather, it was always Kate's own failed trajectory toward becoming a lawyer, which she'd never had the chance to complete, that was the exemplar, a modern, educated, and most of all, independent woman, which she repeatedly held up for Maggie. When Maggie had decided to drop out, Kate had protested. But this idea, Kate, when most irritated with her mother, Maggie called her by her name. This idea, don't you see what it is? It's you wanting me to be you. And you have to get it through your head, Kate. I'm not you. The charge had hit Kate hard because Kate knew the truth of it. And more, knew that Maggie didn't understand the whole truth, its added dimension. That Kate didn't exactly want Maggie to become her, but to become the her that Kate had wanted for herself, but had not achieved. To be a better version of Kate, the fullest Kate that Kate had imagined of herself. Imagine, the key Kate had finally understood, a failure of imagination, a tunnel vision that had led her to encourage Maggie, consciously or not, toward a life Kate conceived for her. No, not just encouraged, pushed, because she'd been unable to grasp that Maggie might be just as complete, just as fulfilled on some other path, some road entirely of Maggie's own making, regardless of her unwillingness or inability to map it out ahead of time. Pushed her not from an overabundance of love, as Kate had always excused herself when along the way she'd been put in doubt by Maggie's resistance, but from a failure of imagination. And one final short piece, just to finish the reading part for tonight, about the emotional side of this phenomenon of a parent's love for a child and the difficulty of knowing how to enact it. Kate, as part of her duties, was maintaining a notebook and jotting down her thoughts about San Francisco, about the industrial, but also her own thoughts. And here's sitting in her hotel room one night, jotting in her notebook. Sunday morning, I've been sitting here in this elegant room on this elegant brocaded chair, brushing out my hair, brushing and brushing. How we used to sit like this, Maggie, you and I, one of us on our so very different chair, in our so very different room, the other standing behind and brushing hair. Is it something you think of too? I miss it so. We began those quiet times together, brushing each other's hair when you were still so small, soon after your father left for the Philippines. And we carried on while we were here in San Francisco, in the little rooms we had on Clay Street, waiting for him to return to us from quarantine. And then when he was here with us, bodily here at least, waiting for him to return from his sorrowful silence, which he never did. And after, through all the years after he was gone for good, we would sit and brush, you and I, and talk. We would talk. Not much, it's true, but the sound of your voice speaking softly only to me, and my simple happiness at touching your hair, your head, without you wanting to wriggle away. Most of all, though, your touch on me. I know you loved me brushing your hair, and the pleasure I got from your pleasure was a gift. But when you were the one doing the brushing, that was of a different order. The heat of it, the sweetness, not just in my hair, my head, but slipping under my skin and sliding down my neck and through my shoulders and coursing into the very center of me. All of me, the whole world, collapsing down into a single ball of warmth. And when finally you'd stop, I'd continue sitting, unable to move or speak. I wanted it to go on forever. Less and less often as you got older, of course, inevitable, I suppose, in the natural order of things. But for me, my wanting it, my hunger for it, never slackened. My desire to hold onto that connection, different from any other, with you, with my child. And properly expressed to you what I felt in those last years when you were still at home and when, oh so rarely, you would bless me with a simple touch. Your hand laid on my hand to calm me when you saw me upset. Your arm taking mine as we walked. And every once in a great while, a hug that came from you. A hug not merely received, but given. Such pleasure I would feel, and gratitude. Yes, overwhelming gratitude when you'd physically touch me. Perhaps all the more because your father's touch was no more. I don't know. But oh, most of all, when you brushed my hair.
Beautiful.
Oh, thanks, everybody.
That is just so beautiful. It's apparent how much respect you have for your characters, for the histories that you write about. And, this is such a rich feast. And I encourage everyone, if you haven't picked up a copy, we've posted links in the chat function with which you may buy the book. Joseph, thank you so very, very much for being with us tonight.
Peter, it's been a great pleasure. And thank you to all the faces I could see. It's wonderful to see faces I haven't seen in a long time and some I don't know, which is also wonderful. But thank you all for listening. And I hope you'll have a chance to read the book, and I hope you'll find it a rich experience. So thank you so much.